On the islands themselves, American intelligence had painstakingly mapped Japanese defensive networks. Photographs taken by reconnaissance planes revealed sprawling tunnel systems, artillery emplacements, and supply caches hidden beneath dense foliage. Each observation confirmed the necessity of aerial bombardment to mitigate anticipated losses. The logistics of napalm deployment required careful coordination. B-29 superfortresses, capable of carrying massive payloads over long distances, became the primary delivery platform. Smaller aircraft supplemented these missions, using low-level strafing runs to drive defenders into the open. Ground commanders worked alongside air officers to plan synchronized attacks, where napalm would precede amphibious landings, scorching the terrain and cutting down the defenders' ability to resist. In many cases, entire defensive positions would be neutralized before infantry even encountered the first opposition. Meanwhile, Japan faced an existential crisis. Its industrial capacity had been severely diminished by strategic bombing campaigns over mainland cities. Oil shortages, collapsed transportation networks, and dwindling ammunition stocks left garrisons isolated. The morale of Japanese troops, once bolstered by the promise of honourable defence and divine protection, began to falter under relentless bombardment. Commanders instructed soldiers to hold positions at all costs, but even the most disciplined units could not counter the combined effect of modern American firepower and the psychological terror of napalm. As US forces prepared for landings on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, a grim certainty emerged. The coming months would not resemble conventional warfare. The next battles would unfold in fire-lit landscapes, where survival depended not only on courage, but on the ability to endure the destructive power of an entirely new form of weapon. By the time the first napalm bombs fell, both sides understood that the rules of engagement in the Pacific had shifted forever, and that victory would come at a cost measured in ash and flame. By late January 1945, the islands of the Western Pacific had become grim laboratories of defensive ingenuity. Japanese commanders, fully aware that American forces were steadily advancing toward the home islands, invested every available resource into fortifying their positions. On Iwo Jima and increasingly on Okinawa and other strategic locations, soldiers laboured day and night carving the volcanic rock into a labyrinth of tunnels, underground bunkers and fortified pillboxes. Every crevice of the terrain was exploited. Caves were reinforced with steel and concrete, hilltops dotted with anti-aircraft guns, and narrow ridges rigged as kill zones for approaching infantry. The Japanese defensive philosophy was brutal and unyielding. Unlike previous campaigns where mobility and counterattacks could alter the battlefield, these positions were designed for attrition. Each bunker was intended to withstand artillery, each tunnel network to shelter troops while allowing them to re-emerge to counterattack. Civilians were often drawn into the effort, tasked with carrying supplies, digging trenches, and reinforcing fortifications. Their presence blurred the line between combatant and non-combatant, a tragic hallmark of the late war Pacific campaigns. Despite these preparations, morale within the Japanese ranks was fraying. The relentless air raids and naval bombardments of 1944-45 had already claimed countless lives, destroyed food stores, and shattered communication lines. Soldiers understood that reinforcements were unlikely, that supplies would not reach them, and that the Allies' overwhelming industrial advantage meant that every defensive position was under siege before it even became operational. Reports from the front describe men whispering of fire raining from the skies, entire villages reduced to smoke, and bunkers collapsing under bombardments. For the Americans, the effectiveness of napalm was both a tactical triumph and a moral weight. Pilots wrote in mission reports about the sheer efficiency of the weapon, but also the human suffering it caused. Many infantrymen, arriving after the napalm strikes, entered landscapes that resembled hellish moonscapes. Bunkers were blackened, twisted wreckage lined the ground, and the air carried the lingering smell of burned flesh and timber. Soldiers had to navigate the ruins cautiously, aware that Japanese defenders could still emerge from surviving tunnels. But the psychological edge had shifted. Survivors reported hesitation and fear among Japanese units. The fire had not only destroyed structures, but had broken morale, creating confusion that US forces would exploit. Napalm fundamentally altered the tactical landscape of Pacific warfare. Traditional bombardments had limited effectiveness against reinforced Japanese bunkers or interconnected cave systems. Artillery could collapse walls, but entrenched soldiers often survived to fight another day. Napalm changed that calculus. It's sticky, high-temperature gels spread across surfaces, seeping into fissures and igniting materials that conventional explosives could not destroy. By saturating the battlefield with fire, American forces could eliminate strongpoints without committing infantry to frontal assaults into certain death. Commanders developed coordinated attack patterns, combining high-altitude napalm bombing with low-level strafing runs and artillery barrages. The strategy was precise. First, napalm would consume vegetation and wooden defences. Then machine guns and rockets would target surviving troops. Finally, infantry would move in to secure the ground. On Iwo Jima and Okinawa, this approach minimized US casualties while maximizing the disintegration of Japanese defensive cohesion. Military reports noted that bunkers once considered impregnable were neutralized within minutes, often with no direct ground engagement required. Napalm's technological design was deceptively simple, yet devastatingly effective. Developed in 1942 by a team of chemists at Harvard, the thickened gasoline gel burned at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It could cling to any surface, penetrate sandbags and light fortifications, and even ignite within cave networks. Delivery systems evolved rapidly. 29 superfortresses capable of carrying up to 20,000 pounds of incendiary material became the primary delivery platform, flying at high altitudes to avoid anti-aircraft fire. Smaller aircraft and fighter bombers carried napalm canisters for precision strikes, often targeting specific strongpoints or tunnels. Integration with existing bombing techniques enhanced its lethality. Reconnaissance teams identified vulnerable terrain, and planners developed layered attack sequences. Napalm's versatility allowed it to supplement traditional bombs, artillery, and infantry operations. Unlike conventional explosives, which often left rubble for defenders to use as cover, napalm removed that advantage entirely. Its psychological effect on the enemy was equally important. The weapon created fear, confusion, and panic, in addition to physical destruction, a combination that traditional ordnance could not replicate. The human suffering, tactical innovation, and technological evolution of napalm together illustrate a weapon that reshaped the final battles of the Pacific War. Yet its impact extended beyond individual strikes. Leadership decisions on both sides, the enemy's response, and the moral weight of fire as a weapon would define the next phase of the campaign. Commanders on both sides faced unprecedented challenges in 1945. For American generals and air officers, the use of napalm represented both a tactical innovation and a profound responsibility. Decisions about where, when, and how to deploy incendiary strikes had to balance maximum military effectiveness against the risk of collateral damage. On Iwo Jima and Okinawa, planners meticulously coordinated B-29 missions, fighter bomber sorties, and artillery barrages to precede amphibious landings. They studied maps and aerial reconnaissance photographs, pinpointing Japanese fortifications, tunnel entrances, and potential civilian zones. Japanese commanders, meanwhile, confronted a nightmare of fire and destruction. They had trained their soldiers to fight to the last man, but conventional defensive strategies failed under the relentless incendiary assaults. Leaders struggled to maintain order within ranks, issuing repeated instructions to hold positions while witnessing entire bunkers consumed in flames. Their decisions were compounded by dwindling supplies, communication breakdowns, and the unrelenting psychological pressure of an enemy capable of striking from the skies with near impunity. Japanese defenders adapted with ingenuity, though increasingly desperate measures could only slow the American advance. Tunnels were reinforced with steel, ventilation shafts were expanded, and firefighting measures, such as water tanks and sandbags, were deployed near critical points. Soldiers learned to anticipate incendiary runs, attempting to shelter in cave networks or retreat into deeper bunkers. Yet, napalm's sticky and highly combustible nature rendered many precautions ineffective. Even a small drop could ignite an entire system of connected tunnels, leaving occupants with no escape. The psychological toll was immense. Units that had previously displayed courage in conventional bombardments found themselves paralyzed by fear of fire. Reports describe soldiers abandoning positions mid-battle, not out of cowardice, but from an instinctive drive to escape flames that consumed everything in their path. Civilians were drawn into the chaos, sometimes forced to assist with logistics, sometimes caught in strikes meant for military targets. The Japanese command faced the grim reality. Their defensive doctrine could no longer guarantee survival, and the morale advantage was shifting decisively to the Americans. Napalm introduced a new ethical dimension to warfare. For US forces, the weapon was undeniably effective, but its human cost weighed heavily on those involved. Mission reports often conveyed the duality of triumph and horror. Entire defensive positions destroyed, but at the expense of lives, both military and civilian. Pilots and infantry observed landscapes transformed into fields of fire, with survivors trapped in conflagrations beyond their control. Some airmen later described a haunting awareness that victory came at a moral cost difficult to reconcile, an early recognition of the ethical dilemmas of modern incendiary warfare. For the Japanese, the psychological effects were immediate and pervasive. Soldiers confronted not only the physical danger of fire, but the terror of a weapon that violated all expectations of conventional battle. The unpredictability of napalm runs, combined with the intensity of its heat, created chaos in even the most disciplined units. Entire garrisons experienced panic, confusion, and fear, leading to breakdowns in command and coordination. Civilians, drawn into fortification efforts or sheltering near military positions, became unwilling witnesses to the destructive power of a war that increasingly targeted the very environment in which humans lived and fought. February 1945. The beaches of Iwo Jima trembled under the roar of American naval guns. Offshore, battleships pounded Japanese fortifications with relentless precision, each salvo sending clouds of dust and fragments into the air. Yet even as shells shredded the surface, beneath the ground Japanese defenders waited, confident in the strength of their tunnels and bunkers. Above them, the sky darkened with approaching B-29s, each laden with napalm bombs designed to transform the volcanic terrain into an inferno. At 9:15, the first wave of incendiaries was released. The bombs struck in coordinated clusters, each container bursting on impact, spreading flaming gel across the ridges and valleys. The fire crept along the volcanic rock, following the contours of trenches, encasing machine gun nests and firing slits in molten tongues. Within minutes, the heat forced defenders to abandon their positions or risk immolation. Soldiers scrambled into the labyrinthine tunnels, only to find smoke and flame advancing through ventilation shafts, making survival a desperate gamble. The American strategy was precise. Reconnaissance had identified primary and secondary defensive nodes, and napalm runs were timed to saturate these areas sequentially. As one cluster ignited a hillside, a second targeted adjacent bunkers, preventing defenders from regrouping. Fighter bombers strafed the remaining positions, while artillery targeted tunnel exits, creating lethal traps for those attempting to escape. The effect was devastating. Bunkers once deemed impregnable collapsed under fire, their occupants trapped or forced into surrender. Observing the assault from above, pilots reported a surreal landscape of fire and smoke. Blackened ridges glowed red from the heat, and flames licked the remains of trees and fortifications. Ground troops, advancing behind the incendiary strikes, moved cautiously but with increasing confidence. Each napalm run cleared areas previously considered too dangerous for infantry, reducing the expected casualties and allowing US forces to advance methodically. Japanese resistance, though fierce, began to unravel. Commanders directed soldiers to hold positions, but the psychological impact of fire was undeniable. Panic and confusion spread through the ranks as communications broke down under the stress of heat, smoke, and the relentless assault. Men who had trained to fight to the last were forced into untenable choices: abandon their posts, face immolation, or confront a fire they could not control. By mid-afternoon, the first major Japanese defensive lines had collapsed. Strategic bunkers, once bristling with machine guns and artillery, were now smouldering ruins. The network of tunnels that had promised protection became death traps as napalm burned its way through connecting shafts. Reports from ground units described an almost cinematic devastation. Entire defensive complexes obliterated, black smoke curling into the sky, and the cries of wounded echoing from the scorched earth. The impact of napalm was not limited to the physical destruction. The morale of remaining Japanese troops plummeted. Units that had previously mounted counterattacks hesitated, retreating to secondary positions. Some soldiers surrendered outright, recognizing the futility of resistance against a weapon capable of reaching into the very caves and bunkers meant to safeguard them. Commanders struggled to maintain order, issuing repeated commands to hold, only to witness a battlefield rapidly disintegrating under fire. American forces seized the momentum. Infantry units, advancing behind the napalm lines, secured positions with minimal casualties. Engineers and medics moved forward, documenting the destruction, mapping the ruined fortifications, and evacuating the wounded. Each success reinforced the strategic doctrine. Incendiary bombardment followed by coordinated ground assault could achieve what conventional attacks had failed to accomplish for months. The systematic neutralization of Japanese strongholds with maximum efficiency. By sunset, the landscape was unrecognizable. Blackened craters, twisted metal, and smouldering bunkers marked the collapse of the island's defenses. The surviving Japanese soldiers retreated deeper into tunnels, their capacity to resist effectively broken. The combination of precise targeting, overwhelming firepower, and the terror induced by napalm had turned the tide of the battle. The first day of coordinated napalm strikes demonstrated a grim reality. The age of fire as a weapon had arrived in the Pacific. Fortifications that had once promised security could no longer shield troops from destruction. The psychological, tactical, and technological superiority of American forces had created a battlefield where survival depended not only on skill and courage, but on an almost impossible endurance of fire. Endurance of fire. As night fell on Iwo Jima, the island was a smouldering tableau of devastation. Fires, fueled by napalm, continued to burn long after the initial strikes, consuming any structures or vegetation that had survived the day's onslaught. Ground troops moved cautiously across the blackened landscape, aware that Japanese defenders might still emerge from deeper tunnels or hidden positions. Engineers advanced ahead, mapping the remnants of the fortifications and marking areas still hazardous with unexploded ordnance or lingering flames. The following morning, American forces resumed the assault. Napalm strikes had softened the defensive positions, but mop-up operations were necessary to secure every bunker and tunnel. Infantry units, accompanied by flamethrower teams, systematically cleared remaining positions. Even the reinforced steel and concrete bunkers could not withstand sustained fire. Trapped defenders either perished or surrendered under the combined pressure of fire, artillery, and advancing troops. Reconnaissance planes overhead recorded the sheer scale of destruction. Ridges once dotted with pillboxes now resembled charred scars. Trenches were rivers of ash, and cave entrances glowed from residual heat. Japanese commanders, realizing the futility of continued resistance, attempted desperate countermeasures. Troops set booby traps, launched sporadic counterattacks, and used camouflage to conceal their movements. Yet the combined psychological and physical impact of napalm was undeniable. Units that had fought tenaciously in previous battles were reduced to fragmented groups, moving stealthily in fear of further bombardment. Reports from American officers describe instances of Japanese soldiers surrendering en masse, sometimes signaling with white flags, acknowledging that their defensive strategy had collapsed. A collapse of the defensive network was accelerated by the precision of American operations. Napalm had neutralized key nodes first: artillery positions, communication hubs, and command bunkers. With these eliminated, Japanese units were isolated and coordination became impossible. Infantry advancing behind napalm lines encountered scattered resistance, but the cohesive defensive effort that had made Iwo Jima formidable months earlier no longer existed. Fire had not only destroyed physical structures, but had unraveled the organizational framework of the defenders. By mid-February, the island's interior was under full American control. The surviving Japanese soldiers had retreated into isolated cave systems, with supplies exhausted and morale shattered. Commanders had little choice but to order guerrilla-style resistance, holding only the most defensible positions in the hope of prolonging the inevitable. Even here, the psychological impact of napalm was evident. Small units abandoned posts under the relentless threat of fire, and the spectre of flames running through tunnels created constant fear. The aftermath of the decisive strikes revealed the true scale of destruction. Entire defensive lines that had once seemed impenetrable were obliterated, leaving nothing but scorched earth and rubble. Observers noted the eerie precision of the operation. Every major strongpoint had been neutralized, most civilian structures destroyed or damaged, and the remaining enemy force demoralized and fragmented. Military reports from the time emphasized that the combination of air-delivered napalm, artillery, and coordinated infantry movements had achieved what months of conventional attacks could not: the systematic collapse of Japanese defenses with relatively limited American casualties. Yet the human cost remained stark. Survivors from Japanese units described the flames engulfing their comrades, the suffocating smoke filling tunnels, and the unrelenting heat driving men from positions they had vowed to defend to the death. Civilians, though fewer in number on the isolated island, were caught in the inferno, forced to flee or perish. American soldiers, too, bore witness to the aftermath, documenting the scale of destruction and recording the profound psychological impact on both sides. By the end of the climax phase, the strategic consequences were clear. The effective use of napalm had rendered traditional defensive structures obsolete, proving that fire could dominate modern warfare in ways previously unimagined. The combination of planning, technology, and psychological warfare had achieved a decisive breakthrough. Japanese defenses had collapsed under flames that consumed not only wood and steel, but morale itself. The battles on Iwo Jima and subsequent islands in the Pacific would demonstrate that future conflicts could no longer rely solely on entrenched fortifications. Napalm, as a weapon of choice, had rewritten the rules of engagement. Destruction was absolute, speed of advance accelerated, and the psychological toll on defenders ensured that victory came sooner than conventional wisdom might have predicted. The success of these operations would directly influence post-battle assessments, strategies for Okinawa, and planning for potential invasion of the Japanese mainland. The flames that consumed Iwo Jima became a lesson in the terrifying efficiency of incendiary warfare, a combination of science, logistics, and human endurance that would forever alter the Pacific theater. By March 1945, the landscape of the Pacific had been irrevocably altered. Iwo Jima, once a network of fortified ridges and hidden tunnels, lay in smouldering ruins. The coordinated napalm strikes had achieved what months of conventional bombardment could not: the systematic destruction of Japanese defensive positions and the neutralization of the island's capacity to resist. US military reports estimated that nearly 90% of bunkers and cave networks had been rendered unusable, while Japanese troop morale had collapsed under the psychological weight of the incendiary assault. Casualty figures reflected the brutal effectiveness of the campaign. On the American side, careful planning and the use of napalm to soften the battlefield kept casualties comparatively lower than previous island assaults, though losses were still significant. Of the 70,000 US Marines and Army personnel engaged in Pacific operations during the early months of 1945, thousands were wounded or killed, a testament to the intense combat conditions even after napalm had cleared the primary defensive positions. Japanese losses were staggering. Tens of thousands of soldiers perished, either in direct combat or consumed by fire, while many others were forced into surrender. Civilian casualties, though lower than in urban bombing campaigns over Japan itself, were not negligible, as villagers caught near fortifications were trapped by the spread of incendiary flames. Strategically, the effectiveness of napalm confirmed its role as a decisive weapon in the late Pacific War. The success of Iwo Jima demonstrated that entrenched positions could no longer guarantee survival against modern American firepower. The combination of aerial bombardment, naval gunfire, and incendiary attacks created a synergistic effect, overwhelming even the most sophisticated Japanese defenses. US commanders took note. The destruction of fortified islands could now be achieved with fewer direct infantry assaults, allowing American forces to advance toward Okinawa and ultimately the Japanese home islands with greater efficiency and confidence. The psychological impact of the napalm campaign extended beyond the battlefield. The Japanese commanders were forced to confront the limits of traditional defense. as even reinforced tunnels and bunkers offered no guarantee against a weapon that could burn its way through stone and steel. Stone. Orders to hold at all costs became increasingly untenable as troops faced flames that defied conventional tactics. Civilian populations, previously shielded by isolation or distance from combat zones, became acutely aware that modern warfare could engulf entire regions in moments, blurring the lines between military and civilian space. American soldiers documented the aftermath with meticulous detail. Engineers mapped destroyed fortifications. Medics recorded injuries from both conventional combat and burns, and pilots debriefed after missions noted the precision and psychological impact of their attacks. These records would inform not only ongoing operations in Okinawa and mainland Japan, but also post-war analyses of incendiary warfare. Historians later observed that the combination of firepower, planning and technological innovation had shifted the balance of power decisively in favour of the Allies, demonstrating that industrial capacity and tactical ingenuity could overcome even the most fanatical defence. Yet the cost of victory was stark. Entire ecosystems on the islands were devastated, civilian villages destroyed and countless lives lost. Napalm had proven to be a weapon of unparalleled effectiveness, but its human and environmental consequences foreshadow the ethical dilemmas that would continue to haunt military planners and historians alike. The flames that swept across Iwo Jima left behind not just scorched earth, but a sobering record of the destructive power of modern warfare. As the smoke cleared and American forces consolidated their positions, it became evident that the Pacific War had entered a new phase. Japanese defensive doctrine, based on resilience and entrenchment, was no longer sufficient. The success of napalm would shape subsequent campaigns, redefine expectations for battlefield strategy, and alter the psychological calculus of war for both attackers and defenders. The destruction wrought by napalm on Iwo Jima and other Pacific islands in early 1945 had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. Strategically, it validated the concept of using incendiary fire as a prelude to ground operations. American commanders incorporated these lessons into subsequent campaigns, most notably the Battle of Okinawa, where coordinated napalm strikes, artillery bombardments, and amphibious assaults allowed US forces to systematically dismantle Japanese defensive networks. Military planners concluded that entrenched fortifications could no longer guarantee defense. Instead, overwhelming firepower could dictate the tempo and outcome of combat. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was profound. Soldiers had been trained to defend every position to the last man, yet the relentless nature of incendiary attacks eroded morale at an unprecedented rate. Entire units surrendered after observing the devastation from napalm, understanding that survival often depended on flight rather than continued resistance. For commanders, the need to adapt became urgent. Tunnel systems and fortified bunkers were supplemented with rudimentary fire breaks and emergency water reservoirs, yet these measures were largely ineffective against a weapon designed to penetrate every layer of defense. Beyond the military sphere, napalm's use highlighted the grim reality of total war. It allowed commanders to achieve objectives that conventional strategies could not, saving countless lives among their own troops. Yet the same effectiveness carried an undeniable ethical weight. The destruction of life and land in seconds forced a reckoning with the realities of modern warfare. That victory could be measured not only in strategic gain, but in profound human loss. Historically, these campaigns reshaped the Pacific theatre. They demonstrated the supremacy of integrated air-ground operations, the decisive power of fire in combat, and the profound influence of psychological warfare on troop morale. Beyond strategy and tactics, they left enduring questions about the limits of technology and the ethics of its use in human conflict. In the end, the story of napalm over Japan is one of transformation, of land, of warfare, and of the human spirit under extreme conditions. The islands were conquered, defences collapsed, and the path to the Japanese mainland was laid bare. Yet the flames burned longer in memory than in the landscape, a stark reminder of the cost of modern war, the fragility of human life, and the enduring consequences of unleashing fire upon the world.